Welcome to Part 3 of Murder on Broadway. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 11. Seeking Information. Tuesday, June 11, 9 p.m. 10 minutes later, we stood ringing the bell of an impressive old brownstone house on East 44th Street. An elegantly dressed butler opened the door, and Stanford handed him his card. "Please take this to the doctor immediately, and say it's urgent." "The doctor is just finishing dinner," the butler replied with an air of formality. He then led us into a richly decorated reception room filled with deep, comfortable chairs, luxurious drapes, and soft lighting. "A classic gynecologist's lair," Quentin remarked as he glanced around. "I have no doubt the doctor himself is a grand and refined individual." As it turned out, he was correct. Dr. Jensen entered the room moments later, looking at the district attorney's card as if it were a mysterious code he couldn't quite understand. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with thick hair and eyebrows, and an unusually pale complexion. His face was long, and despite the unevenness of his features, he could easily be considered handsome. He wore dinner attire and carried himself with a self-important precision, clearly conscious of his own significance. He settled himself at an intricately carved mahogany desk and lifted his gaze with polite curiosity towards Stanford. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" he inquired in a heavily affected, melodious tone, each word pronounced with deliberate care. "You are quite fortunate to have found me at home," he interjected before Stanford could respond. "I generally see patients only by appointment." It was clear he felt a certain embarrassment at having received us without the usual formalities. Stanford, who disliked all forms of pretension, went straight to the point. "This isn't a professional consultation, Doctor. I need to discuss one of your former patients, Miss Eleanor Simon." Dr. Jensen stared at the gold paperweight on his desk with a distant, reminiscent gaze. "Ah, yes, Miss Simon. I just read about her tragic end. A most unfortunate affair indeed. How can I assist you today? You know, of course, that the bond between a doctor and his patient is one of utmost trust." "I completely understand that," Stanford interjected sharply. "However, it is the responsibility of every citizen to help the authorities in bringing a murderer to justice. If there's anything you can share that could help in this matter, I expect you to do so." The doctor raised a hand slightly, as if to politely object. "I will, of course, do everything I can to assist you, provided you specify what you need." "There's no need for subtlety, Doctor," Stanford replied. "I know Miss Simon was your patient for quite some time, and I believe it's very likely, if not certain, that she shared personal details with you that could be relevant to her death." "But my dear Mr." Dr. Jensen glanced pointedly at the card. "Ah, Stanford, my relationship with Miss Simon was strictly professional." "I had thought, though," Stanford ventured, "that while what you say may be technically correct, there was an informality to that connection. I suppose I mean to say your professional care extended beyond mere clinical interest in her case." I heard Quentin chuckle softly, and I struggled to hide a smile at Stanford's elaborate accusation. But Dr. Jensen seemed unfazed. Adopting a thoughtful demeanor, he said, "To be perfectly honest, during the extended treatment of her case, I did come to regard the young woman with a certain, shall I say, fatherly fondness. But I doubt she even realized this mild sentiment on my part." Quentin's lips twitched at the corners. He sat with his eyes half closed, watching the doctor with a look of amused curiosity. "And she never confided in you about any personal troubles or worries that were preoccupying her?" Stanford pressed. Dr. Jensen steepled his fingers and seemed to give the question his full attention. "No, I can't say I recall any specific statement like that." His words were slow and polished. "I'm aware, generally speaking, of her lifestyle, but you can understand that the particulars were beyond my role as a medical consultant. The disruption of her nerves was, as I concluded, due to late nights, excitement, irregular meals, and what I believe is often referred to as living life in the fast lane. The modern woman in this overstimulated age, sir. When did you see her last, if I might ask? Stanford interrupted, his impatience evident. The doctor feigned dramatic surprise. When did I see her last? Let me think. He seemed to struggle to recollect the date. Perhaps a fortnight ago, though it might have been longer. I honestly can't remember. Would you like me to check my records? That won't be necessary, Stanford replied. He paused, studying the doctor with a disarming friendliness. And was this last visit more of a personal or strictly a professional nature? Strictly professional, of course. Dr. Jensen's gaze remained neutral and only mildly curious. However, I sensed that his expression didn't fully represent his thoughts. Did your meeting take place here, or at her apartment? I believe I visited her at home. You seem to have visited her quite often, Doctor, so I've heard, and at rather unusual hours. Does that align with your standard practice of seeing patients only by appointment? Stanford's tone was friendly, but I could tell he was clearly annoyed by the doctor's polished insincerity and suspected he was withholding important information. Before Dr. Jensen could respond, the butler appeared at the door, silently indicating an extension telephone on a small table beside the desk. With a slick apology, the doctor turned and picked up the receiver. Seizing the moment, Quentin quickly jotted down a note and discreetly passed it to Stanford. Once he finished his call, Dr. Jensen stood up straight, looking down at Stanford with icy contempt. Is it the role of the district attorney, he inquired coldly, to badger respectable physicians with disrespectful questions? I was under the impression that it wasn't illegal, or even particularly unique, for a doctor to attend to his patients. I'm not discussing, Stanford stressed the word, your violations of the law right now. But since you've introduced a notion I assure you hadn't crossed my mind, would you kindly inform me, just as a formality, where you were last night between 11 and 12? The question hit him like a jolt. Dr. Jensen appeared suddenly rigid, and as he slowly rose to his feet, he glared at the district attorney with a cold, venomous rage. His calm facade had cracked, revealing beneath it a raw fear, with his anger only partially hiding a deep uncertainty. It's none of your business where I was last night. He spoke with evident strain, his breaths coming in quick bursts. Stanford remained composed, his eyes fixed intently on the trembling man before him, and this steady gaze completely shattered Jensen's composure. What do you mean by barging in here with your despicable insinuations? He yelled. His face, now pale and splotchy, twisted grotesquely, his hands moved erratically, and his entire body convulsed as if seized by a tremor. Get out of here, you and your 2 lackeys. Leave before I have you thrown out. Stanford, now equally furious, opened his mouth to respond when Quentin took hold of his arm. The doctor is rather politely suggesting we leave, he observed. In one swift motion, he turned Stanford around and guided him out of the room. Once we were back in the taxi heading to the club, Quentin chuckled lightly. What a marvelous specimen he is. Paranoid, or perhaps he's suffering from manic-depressive illness, the Foley circulaire type. Alternating episodes of manic excitement and clear-headedness, don't you think? In any case, the doctor's condition falls neatly into the category of psychoses, linked to the ebb and flow of the sexual instinct. He's the perfect age, really. A neurotic degenerate, that's exactly what this slick charlatan is. In another minute he would have attacked you. Good heavens, it's a blessing I stepped in. Men like him are as dangerous as rattlesnakes. He shook his head, in feigned disappointment. Honestly, you know, Stanford, my old friend, he continued, you should pay more attention to the signs of those around you. What the face reveals is a window to the soul. Did you happen to notice the man's square forehead, his uneven eyebrows and those pale, shining eyes? And his prominent ears with their thin edges, pointed tragus and split lobes? He's a clever one, this Ambrice, but morally bankrupt. Stay away from those pseudo-piriform faces, Stanford. Let their Apollonian Greek allure be the concern of hopeless romantics. I wonder what he really knows, Stanford muttered irritably. Oh, he knows something, make no mistake about that. And if only we could figure it out, we'd be much further along in this investigation. Besides, the information he's hiding is likely tied to himself in an uncomfortable way. His smugness is a bit shaken. He put on a grand show, but his parting words revealed his true feelings toward us. Yes, Stanford agreed. That question about last night detonated like a bomb. What made you suggest I ask it? A few things. His unnecessary and clearly false claim that he had just read about the murder. His completely insincere lecture on the importance of professional secrets. The overly cautious and self-righteous way he spoke about his fatherly affection for the girl. And his overly dramatic struggle to recall when he last saw her. Especially this last point, I think, raised my suspicions. And then there were the psychological signs evident in his features. Well, Stanford conceded, the question did have an impact. I have a feeling I'll be seeing this trendy doctor again. You will, Quentin affirmed. We caught him off guard. But once he's had some time to think things over and come up with a charming excuse, he'll talk your ear off. In any case, the evening has wrapped up, and you can daydream about buttercups until tomorrow. But the evening wasn't quite over, where the Simon case was concerned. We had only returned to the club's lounge for a short while when a man strolled past our corner, bowing formally to Stanford. To my surprise, Stanford stood and returned the greeting, gesturing for the man to take a seat. There's something else I wanted to ask you, Mr. Trafford, he said, if you have a moment to spare. Hearing the name, I studied the man closely, as I couldn't help but be curious about the mysterious companion who had taken the girl to dinner and the theatre the previous night. Trafford embodied the essence of a New England aristocrat, stiff, slow in his movements, reserved, and dressed in a quietly stylish manner. His hair and mustache were tinged with grey, which likely accentuated the rosiness of his complexion. He stood just under 6 feet tall, well-built but slightly angular. Stanford introduced him to Quentin and me, explaining that we were assisting him on the case, and that he thought it best to be completely transparent with us. Trafford shot Stanford a skeptical look, but quickly nodded in acceptance of the arrangement. I'm at your disposal, Mr. Stanford, he said in a refined, yet somewhat high-pitched voice, and I agree with whatever you deem appropriate. He turned to Quentin and offered an apologetic smile. I find myself in a rather uncomfortable situation and naturally feel a bit sensitive about it. I consider myself something of a rebel against convention, Quentin replied cheerfully. In any case, I'm not a moralist. My perspective on the matter is quite theoretical. Trafford chuckled lightly. I wish my family could see things that way. Sadly, I doubt they would be so forgiving of my shortcomings. It's only fair to inform you, Mr. Trafford, interrupted Stanford. There's a chance I may need to call you as a witness. The man glanced up, his expression darkening, but he remained silent. Here's the situation, Stanford continued. We're about to make an arrest, and your testimony could be crucial in confirming the time Miss Simon returned to her apartment, as well as supporting the fact that someone was likely in her rooms after you left. The screams and calls for help that you heard might become key evidence in securing a conviction. Trafford appeared somewhat distressed at the thought of his association with the young woman being exposed, and for several moments he sat with his gaze averted. I understand your concern, he finally admitted, but it would be devastating for me if my past transgressions were revealed. That situation can definitely be avoided, Stanford reassured him. I promise you won't be called unless it's absolutely essential. Now, what I really wanted to ask you is if you know a Dr. Jensen, who I understand was Miss Simon's personal physician. Trafford looked genuinely confused. I've never heard of him, he replied. In fact, Miss Simon never mentioned any doctor to me. And did you ever hear her mention the name Porter, or refer to anyone as Tony? Never, his tone was firm. Stanford fell into a disappointed silence. Trafford, too, was quiet, lost in thought. You know, Mr. Stanford, he said after a few minutes, I should be embarrassed to admit it, but the truth is I cared quite a bit for the girl. I assume her apartment is being kept just as it was." He hesitated, and a look almost of pleading crossed his face. "I'd really like to see it again, if that's possible." Stanford regarded him with sympathy, but eventually shook his head. "That wouldn't be appropriate. You'd surely be recognized by the operator, or perhaps there's a reporter around, and then I wouldn't be able to keep you out of this case." The man looked disappointed but didn't argue. For several moments, silence fell among them. Finally, Quentin shifted slightly in his chair. "Mr. Trafford, do you remember anything strange that happened last night during the half-hour you spent with Miss Simon after the theatre?" "Unusual." Trafford's face showed clear surprise. "On the contrary. We chatted for a bit, and then, seeing that she seemed tired, I said good night and left, making a lunch appointment with her for today. And yet, it now seems quite likely that another man was hiding in her apartment while you were there." "There's no doubt about that," Trafford replied, shuddering slightly. "And her screams suggest he emerged from his hiding place just moments after I left." "Did you have any inkling of this when you heard her calling for help?" "I did at first, of course, but when she assured me that everything was fine and told me to go home, I assumed her screams were just a bad dream. I knew she had been exhausted and left her in the wicker chair near the door, from where her screams seemed to come, so I thought she had simply dozed off and called out in her sleep. If only I hadn't taken that for granted." "It's a distressing situation." Quentin paused for a moment, then asked, "Did you happen to notice if the living room closet door was open or closed?" Trafford frowned, as if trying to recall the scene, but it seemed to elude him. "I believe it was closed. I would have noticed if it were open." "Then you can't say whether the key was in the lock or not?" "Good heavens, no. I'm not even sure it ever had a key." The discussion about the case continued for another 30 minutes before Trafford excused himself and departed. "It's amusing," Stanford mused, "how a man raised the way he was could be drawn to someone so frivolous and flighty." "I think it makes perfect sense," Quentin replied. "You really are impossible with your moralizing, Stanford." Chapter 12. Circumstantial Evidence. Wednesday, June 12, 9 a.m. The next day, Wednesday, not only brought a crucial and seemingly definitive turn in the Simon case, but also marked the beginning of Quentin's active involvement in the proceedings. He found the psychological aspects of the case irresistibly intriguing, and even at this early stage of the investigation, he believed that a definite resolution could not be reached through the typical police methods. At his request, Stanford picked him up just before 9 o'clock, and we drove straight to the district attorney's office. Oscar was waiting for us, his impatience apparent. His expression, eager and secretly triumphant, suggested that he had good news. "Things are looking great," he announced as we settled into our seats. He was too excited to sit still, standing at Stanford's desk and rolling a large black cigar between his fingers. "We caught the dude, 6 o'clock last evening, and we got him good. One of the CO guys, a fellow named Riley, was patrolling 6th Avenue in the 30s. He saw the dude get off a streetcar and head for McAnerney's pawn shop. Right away, Riley signaled the traffic officer on the corner and followed the dude into McAnerney's. Before long, the traffic officer came in with a patrolman he had picked up, and the three of them caught our stylish friend in the act of pawning this ring. He tossed a square solitaire diamond, set in filigreed platinum, onto the district attorney's desk. I was at the office when they brought him in, and I sent Barron with the ring up to Harlem to see what the maid had to say about it, and she identified it as belonging to Simon. But I must say, it wasn't part of the jewelry the lady was wearing that night, was it, Sergeant?" Quentin asked casually. Oscar turned sharply, regarding him with a sullen evaluation. "What if it was? It came straight out of that pried-open jewelry box, or I'm Ben-Hur." "Of course it did," Quentin murmured, slipping into a state of lethargy. "And that's our lucky break," Oscar said, turning back to Stanford. "It links Porter directly to the murder and the robbery." "What does Porter have to say about it?" Stanford leaned forward, focused. I assume you questioned him. We sure did, the sergeant replied, but his tone was uneasy. We had him up all night, putting him through the ringer, and here's the story he tells. He claims the girl gave him the ring a week ago, and he didn't see her again until the afternoon of the day before yesterday. He came to her apartment between 4 and 5. You remember the maid said she was out then, and he went in and out through the side door, which was unlocked at the time. He admits he showed up again at 9:30 that night, but he says when he found she was out, he went straight home and stayed there. His alibi is that he spent the night with his landlady playing kun-kan and drinking beer. I swung by his place this morning, and the old gal confirmed it, but that doesn't mean much. The house he lives in is a rough spot, and the landlady, besides being a heavy drinker, has been in jail a couple of times for shoplifting. What does Porter say about the fingerprints? He says, of course, he made them when he was there in the afternoon. And the one on the closet doorknob. Oscar let out a derisive grunt. He's got an excuse for that, too. Claims he thought he heard someone coming in, so he hid himself in the clothes closet. Didn't want to be seen and ruin any scheme Simon might have been working on. How considerate of him to stay out of the way of the lovely ladies, Quentin drawled. Such touching loyalty, don't you think? You don't actually believe that rat, do you, Mr. Quentin? Oscar asked, incredulity evident in his voice. Can't say that I do. But our Antonio, at least, tells a convincing story. That's too convincing for my liking, the sergeant muttered. Is that really all you could get from him? It was clear that Stanford was frustrated with the outcome of Oscar's intense questioning of Porter. That's about it, sir. He clung to his story like a barnacle. You didn't find any chisel in his room. Oscar conceded that he hadn't. But you couldn't reasonably expect him to keep something like that on hand, he added. Stanford weighed the facts for several moments. I don't see that we have a strong case, despite our suspicions about Porter's guilt. His alibi may be flimsy, but combined with the phone operator's account, I believe it would stand up in court. What about the ring, sir? Oscar asked, his disappointment palpable. And what about his threats, his fingerprints, and his history of similar break-ins? Those are just supporting details, Stanford clarified. For a murder case, we need more than just a surface-level case. A skilled defense attorney could have him cleared in 20 minutes, even if I managed to secure an indictment. It's possible that the woman gave him the ring a week ago. You recall that the maid mentioned he was asking her for money around then. And there's no indication that the fingerprints weren't made late Monday afternoon. Furthermore, we can't prove he had any connection to the chisel, since we don't know who committed the Park Avenue burglary last summer. His entire narrative fits the facts perfectly, and we don't have anything to contradict it. Oscar shrugged in defeat. All the energy had drained from him. What do you think we should do with him? He asked, despondent. Stanford considered his response. He too felt unsettled. Before I decide, I think I'll talk to him myself. He pressed a buzzer and requested a clerk to fill out the necessary forms. Once it was signed in duplicate, he sent Donovan off to Ben Hanlon. Make sure to ask him about those silk shirts, Quentin suggested, and see if he thinks a white waistcoat is essential with a dinner jacket. This office isn't a men's clothing shop, Stanford snapped. But, darling Stanford, you won't learn anything else from this Petronius character. 10 minutes later, a deputy sheriff from the Tombs walked in with his handcuffed prisoner. Porter's appearance that morning was a far cry from his nickname, Dude. He looked haggard and pale. The events of the previous night had clearly taken their toll. He hadn't shaved, his hair was unkempt, the ends of his mustache drooped, and his cravat was askew. Yet, despite his disheveled state, he managed to carry himself with an air of defiance and arrogance. He shot Oscar a challenging look, and met the district attorney's gaze with a swaggering nonchalance. To Stanford's questions, he stubbornly repeated the same story he'd told Oscar, clinging tightly to every detail as if it were a lesson he had painstakingly memorized. Stanford coaxed, threatened, and bullied. All trace of his usual charm had vanished. He was like a relentless machine. However, Porter, whose nerves seemed made of iron, faced the onslaught of questioning without flinching. I must admit that, despite my distaste for him and everything he represented, his resilience sparked a bit of admiration in me. After half an hour, Stanford finally gave up, completely baffled by his inability to extract any damaging admissions from the man. Just as he was about to dismiss him, Quentin lazily rose and strolled over to the district attorney's desk. Sitting on the edge of it, he regarded Porter with detached curiosity. "So you're a fan of Khan, huh?" he remarked casually. "Silly game, isn't it? More interesting than Quain or rum, though. It used to be played in the London clubs, if I'm not mistaken. You still play it with 2 decks, I assume, and allow round-the-corner mating." Porter's forehead creased in an involuntary frown. He was accustomed to aggressive district attorneys and had dealt with the brutal tactics of the police, but this was a new kind of interrogator for him. It was clear he felt both confused and uneasy. He resolved to face this unfamiliar opponent with a condescending smile. "By the way," Quentin continued, maintaining his tone, "is there anyone hiding in the clothes closet of the Simon living room who can see the Davenport through the keyhole?" In an instant, the man's smile vanished completely. "And I ask you," Quentin pressed on, his gaze fixed on the other man, "why didn't you raise the alarm?" I watched Porter closely. While his expression remained unchanged, I noticed his pupils widen. Stanford seemed to notice this too. "Don't feel obliged to answer," Quentin said, as Porter opened his mouth to reply. "But tell me this, didn't the sight shock you a little?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Porter shot back, trying to sound defiantly indifferent. Yet, despite his composure, there was a hint of anxiety in his demeanor. His effort to appear unfazed undermined his words. "Not a pleasant situation, is it?" Quentin ignored his retort. "How did it feel, crouched there in the dark, when the closet doorknob started to turn and someone tried to get in?" His eyes drilled into Porter, even though his voice remained casual. The muscles in Porter's face tensed, but he remained silent. "Good thing you locked yourself in, right? What if he had managed to open the door? Good heavens! Then what?" He paused, smiling with a smooth charm that felt more intimidating than any aggressive glare. "Tell me, did you have your steel chisel ready for him? Maybe he'd have been too fast and strong for you. Perhaps there would have been hands pressing against your throat before you could even strike. Did you think about that while you were hiding in the dark? No, not exactly a pleasant situation. A bit gruesome, actually." "What are you rambling on about?" Porter shot back defiantly. "You've lost your mind." Yet for a fleeting moment, horror flickered across his face, and his bravado slipped. But just as quickly his smirk returned, and he tossed his head back in disdain. Quentin strolled back to his chair and sank into it languidly, as if his interest in the case had completely faded. Stanford observed this little scene closely, while Oscar sat nearby, smoking with clearly suppressed irritation. The ensuing silence was broken by Porter. "Well, I guess I'm about to be railroaded. You've got it all figured out, don't you? Go ahead and try to railroad me." He let out a harsh laugh. "My lawyer's Abe Rubin, and you might as well let him know I'd like to have a word with him." At that time, Abe Rubin was the most cunning and ruthless criminal lawyer in New York. Following his disbarment 2 years prior, he had been mostly out of the public eye. Stanford, visibly irritated, signaled to the deputy sheriff to take Porter back to the Tombs. "What were you trying to get at?" he asked Quentin once Porter was gone. "Just a fleeting idea from somewhere deep inside me, struggling to come to light," Quentin replied, taking a calm drag from his cigarette. "I thought Mr. Porter might be convinced to open up to us, so I tried to charm him with my words." "That's just great," Oscar scoffed. "I was half expecting you to ask him if he played mumbly-peg or if his grandmother was a hoot owl." "Sergeant, dear Sergeant," Quentin implored, "please don't be cruel. I simply couldn't bear it. And honestly, didn't my conversation with Mr. Porter spark any thoughts for you?" "Sure," Oscar replied, "that he was hiding in the closet when Simon was killed. But where does that leave us?" They let Porter go, even though he was clearly guilty, caught in the act with some stolen goods. He turned to the district attorney, irritation evident in his voice. "So now what?" "I don't like how this looks," Stanford said, frowning. "If Porter has Abe Rubin defending him, we won't stand a chance. I'm sure he was involved, but no judge will consider my gut feelings as proof." "We could release the dude and keep him under surveillance," Oscar suggested reluctantly. "Maybe we'll catch him doing something that will give us a lead." Stanford thought it over. "That could work," he agreed. "We won't gather any more evidence with him behind bars." "It seems like our only option, sir." "All right," Stanford said. "Let him believe we're done with him. He might get sloppy. I'm putting this in your hands, Sergeant. Keep a couple of good men with him at all times. Something could come up." Oscar stood, looking worried. "Understood, sir. I'll take care of it." "And I want more information on Charles Brady," Stanford added. "Look into his relationship with the Simon girl. Also, get me some background on Dr. Ambrose Jensen. What's his story? What are his habits? You know what I need. He treated the girl for some strange or perhaps imaginary illness, and I suspect he's hiding something. But don't approach him directly. Yet." Oscar wrote down the name in his notebook, without much enthusiasm. "And before you let your stylish captive go," Quentin yawned, "you might want to check if he has a key that opens the Simon apartment." Oscar paused, a grin breaking across his face. "Now that's a clever idea. It's surprising I didn't consider it myself." After shaking hands with the others, he left the room. Chapter 13. An erstwhile gallant. Wednesday, June 12, 10:30 a.m. Donovan was clearly waiting for a chance to make his entrance. As soon as Sergeant Oscar stepped through the door, Donovan quickly followed. "The reporters are here, sir," he said, making a face. "You said you'd meet with them at 10:30. With a nod from his chief, Donovan held the door open, and a dozen or more journalists walked in. "No questions this morning, please," Stanford urged with a friendly smile. "It's too early for that, but I'll share all the information I have. I agree with Sergeant Oscar that the Simon murder was committed by a professional, the same one who broke into Arnheim's house on Park Avenue last summer." He briefly recounted Inspector Brenner's findings regarding the chisel. "We haven't made any arrests yet, but we expect one soon. The police have a solid grasp on the case, but they're proceeding cautiously to ensure there's no chance of an acquittal. We've already recovered some of the stolen jewelry." Stanford spoke with the reporters for about 5 minutes, refraining from mentioning the testimony of the maid or the phone operators, and carefully avoided revealing any names. Once they were alone again, Quentin chuckled with admiration. "A brilliant dodge, my dear Stanford. Your legal training has its perks, certainly has its perks. We've recovered some of the stolen jewelry, such sweet, carefully chosen words, not a single lie, oh no, but how misleading. Honestly, I should spend more time honing my skills in the art of suggestio falsi and suppressio veri. You deserve a crown of myrtle for your craft." "Putting all that aside," Stanford interjected impatiently, "tell me, now that Oscar's gone, what were you thinking when you worked your verbal magic on Porter? What was all this talk about conjurers, dark closets, alarms, pressing thumbs, and peering through keyholes?" "Honestly, I didn't think my little conversation was that enigmatic," Quentin replied. "The elusive Tony was certainly hiding in the wardrobe at some point that fateful evening, and I was just trying, rather clumsily, I admit, to figure out when exactly he was concealed." "And did you find out?" "Not definitively." Quentin shook his head, looking glum. "You see, Stanford, I have this theory. It's vague, murky, and pretty flimsy, downright confusing, really. Even if it were proven true, I can't see how it would help us, because it would make the situation even harder to understand. Sometimes, I wish I hadn't asked Oscar's Bo Nash about it. He really threw my ideas into turmoil." "From what I gather, you seem to think it's possible that Porter witnessed the murder. That couldn't be your precious theory, could it?" "That's part of it, at least." My dear Quentin, you truly amaze me, Stanford burst out laughing. So, you're saying Porter is innocent, but he keeps what he knows to himself, creates an alibi, and remains silent even when arrested. That doesn't add up. I know, Quentin sighed. It's a complete mess. And yet that idea keeps nagging at me. It grips me like a nightmare. It's eating away at me. Do you understand that your wild theory assumes that when Trafford and Miss Simon returned from the theatre, there were two men hiding in the apartment, two men who didn't know each other, namely Porter and your imagined murderer? Of course I realize that, and the very thought of it is driving me mad. Moreover, they must have entered the apartment separately and hidden in different spots. How, may I ask, did they get in? How did they get out? And which one was responsible for the girl's scream after Trafford left? What was the other one doing at that time? And if Porter was just a horrified bystander, how do you explain him breaking open the jewelry case and taking the ring? Stop. Please, don't torment me like this, Quentin begged. I know I'm not quite right in the head. I've had hallucinations since I was a child, but good heavens, I've never experienced anything as bizarre as this. On that point, my dear Quentin, we are in perfect agreement, Stanford replied with a smile. Just then, Donovan stepped in and handed Stanford a letter. It was delivered by messenger and marked urgent, he explained. The letter, written on thick, engraved stationery, was from Dr. Jensen. It stated that between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. on Monday night, he had been attending to a patient at his sanitarium. It included an apology for his behavior when questioned about his whereabouts, offering a long-winded but rather unconvincing explanation. He had faced a particularly grueling day, it seemed, as neurotic cases are notoriously difficult. The suddenness of our visit, combined with Stanford's pointed inquiries, had thrown him completely off balance. He expressed his regret for his outburst and assured us he would help in any way possible. It was unfortunate, he added, that he had lost his temper, as it would have been easy for him to clarify what happened on Monday night. He has reflected on the situation and now provides you with a convenient little alibi that's going to be hard to challenge. A clever trick, just like all these unstable pseudopsychiatrists. Look, he claims he was with a patient. But what patient? One too sick to be asked anything. There you have it. A dead end posing as an alibi. Not much, is it? It doesn't really pique my interest, Stanford replied, putting the letter aside. That pompous buffoon couldn't have entered the Simon apartment without being seen, and I can't imagine him sneaking in through some roundabout way. He reached for a stack of papers. Now, if you don't mind, I'll try to earn my $15,000 salary. But instead of leaving, Quentin strolled over to the table and opened the telephone directory. Let me make a suggestion, Stanford, he said after a brief search. Why not pause your work for a moment, and let's have a polite chat with Mr. Louis Julian. He's the only potential admirer of the elusive Eleanor who hasn't been granted an audience yet. I'm curious to see him and hear what he has to say. He'd certainly round out the family picture, so to speak. It looks like he's still in Maiden Lane, and we could easily fetch him here. Stanford turned halfway around in his chair at the mention of Julian's name. He began to object, but he knew from experience that Quentin's suggestions were seldom just flights of fancy. He paused for a moment to consider. With nearly every other avenue of inquiry blocked for now, the idea of questioning Julian began to appeal to him. Fine, he agreed, calling for Donovan, although I don't see how he can help. According to Oscar, the Simon girl let him go a year ago. He might still be a bit ruffled, or like Hotspur enraged. You never know. Quentin resumed his seat. With a name like that, he definitely warrants some investigation. Stanford sent Donovan to fetch Tracy, and when Tracy arrived, all smiles and charm, he was instructed to take the district attorney's car and bring Julian to the office. Get a subpoena, Stanford added, and use it if you have to. About half an hour later, Tracy returned. Mr. Julian had no trouble coming, he reported. He was quite agreeable, in fact. He's in the waiting room now. Tracy was dismissed, and Julian was beckoned inside. He was a sizable man, moving with a forced spring in his step that captured the silent struggle of a man in the early stages of middle age, trying to resist the passage of time and hold onto the appearance of youth. He carried a slender cane and wore a checkered suit, a brocaded waistcoat, pearl-grey gaiters, and a flamboyantly decorated Homburg hat, which gave him a somewhat foppish air. But these playful details faded from view when one examined his face. His small eyes gleamed with a shrewd intelligence. His nose was somewhat pinched, looking out of place above his thick, sensual lips and protruding jaw. There was an oily slickness about him, a blend of cunning and repulsion that was difficult to ignore. At a gesture from Stanford, he perched on the edge of a chair, resting his pudgy hands on his knees, his demeanor one of wary suspicion. "Mr. Julian," Stanford began, a note of apology creeping into his voice, "I apologize for any inconvenience, but the situation is both serious and urgent. A Miss Eleanor Simon was murdered the night before last, and during our investigation, we discovered you knew her quite well at one time. I thought you might have some information that could help us with our inquiries." A smile, slick, and intended to be friendly, stretched across Julian's heavy lips. "Of course, I knew Eleanor many years ago, you see." He allowed himself a wistful sigh. "She was a lovely lady, if I may say so, quite the looker and always dressed to impress. Such a shame she didn't pursue a career in show business." "But," he said, dismissively waving his hand, "I haven't seen the lady, you understand, for over a year. Not if you know what I mean." Julian was clearly on edge, his sharp little eyes fixed on the district attorney's face without faltering. "Did you have a disagreement with her?" Stanford asked, sounding indifferent. "Well, I wouldn't say we had a quarrel. No." Julian took a moment to find the right word. "You could say we disagreed. We grew tired of the arrangement and naturally drifted apart. The last thing I told her was, if she ever needed a friend, she would know where to find me." "How generous of you," Stanford murmured. "And you never reignited your little affair?" "Never, absolutely not. I don't recall speaking to her since that day." "Given some things I've learned, Mr. Julian," Stanford said, his tone tinged with regret, "I must ask you a rather personal question. Did she ever try to blackmail you?" Julian hesitated, his eyes narrowing further as if deep in thought. "Certainly not," he replied with exaggerated emphasis. "Not at all, nothing of the sort." He raised his hands as if to ward off the notion. Then, looking uneasy, he asked, "What made you think that?" "I've been informed," Stanford explained, "that she had extorted money from a couple of her admirers." Julian gave a completely unconvincing look of surprise. "Really, you don't say? Can that be true?" He squinted at the district attorney, calculating. "Perhaps it was Charlie Brady she blackmailed, was it?" Stanford seized on this. "Why would you mention Brady?" Julian waved his hand again, this time dismissively. "No particular reason, you understand. Just thought it might be him. No special reason." "Did Brady ever mention to you that he'd been blackmailed?" "Brady tell me? Now I ask you, Mr. Stanford, why would Brady tell me that? Why would he?" "And you never told Brady that the Simon girl had blackmailed you?" "Absolutely not." Julian let out a mocking laugh that was far too theatrical to be genuine. "Me tell Brady I was blackmailed." "That's quite amusing, isn't it?" "Then why did you bring up Brady just now?" "No reason at all, like I said. He knew the Cardinal, but that's hardly a secret." Stanford dropped the topic. "What do you know about Miss Simon's connection to Dr. Ambrose Jensen?" Julian looked visibly confused. "Never heard of him, not at all. She didn't know him while I was taking her around." "Who else, besides Brady, did she know well?" Julian shook his head slowly. "Now I couldn't say for sure, definitely couldn't say. I saw her with this man and that one, just like everyone else did. But who they were, I don't know, absolutely." "Have you ever heard of Tony Porter?" Stanford leaned in, meeting Julian's gaze with curiosity. Julian hesitated again, his eyes flickering with calculation. "Well, since you mention it, I believe I did hear of the guy. But I can't swear to it, you understand. What makes you think I've heard of this Porter fellow? Stanford ignored the question. Can you think of anyone who might have had a grudge against Miss Simon, or had reason to fear her? Julian insisted emphatically that he had no knowledge of anyone like that. After a few more questions that resulted in nothing but denials, Stanford released him. Not bad at all, Stanford, my old friend. What do you think? Quentin seemed pleased with the discussion. I wonder why he's so evasive. Julian's not a pleasant fellow, and he's clearly anxious to avoid sharing information. Once again, I wonder why. He was so very cautious. Oh, so very cautious. He was careful enough, at least, not to tell us anything, Stanford said gloomily. I wouldn't say that, you know. Quentin reclined and smoked leisurely. There were glimpses of insight here and there. Our fur-importing lover denied being blackmailed, which is obviously untrue, and attempted to convince us that he and the lovely Eleanor parted like lovebirds. Nonsense. And then there was that mention of Brady. That was no accident. Goodness, no. Brother Julian and spontaneity are as different as night and day. He had a reason for bringing Brady into the mix, and I bet if you knew what that reason was, you'd feel like showering him with roses and all that sort of thing. But why Brady? That half-hearted explanation was pretty weak. These two lovers must have crossed paths at some point. At least Julian inadvertently gave us a hint about that. Plus, it's clear he doesn't know our trendy healer with the satyr-like ears. However, he does know about Mr. Porter and seems eager to deny their connection. So there's the situation. Lots of information, but really, what are we supposed to do with it? I'm stumped, Stanford admitted in defeat. I get it. It's a tough, tough world, Quentin sympathized. But you've got to look at the mess with a hopeful heart. It's lunchtime, and a fillet of sole marguerie will brighten your spirits. Stanford checked the clock and allowed himself to be guided to the Lawyers' Club. Chapter 14. Quentin outlines a theory. Wednesday, June 12, evening. Quentin and I didn't head back to the district attorney's office after lunch. Stanford had a busy afternoon ahead, and nothing more was likely to happen regarding the Simon case until Sergeant Oscar finished his investigations into Brady and Dr. Jensen. Quentin had tickets for Giordano's, Madame Sansgain, and by 2 o'clock we found ourselves at the Metropolitan. Although the performance was superb, Quentin seemed too preoccupied to appreciate it. After the opera, he instructed the chauffeur to take us to the Beaumont Club. I knew he had a tea appointment and had intended to drive to Longview for dinner. The fact he set aside these social plans to be with Stanford showed just how consumed he was by the murder case. It was after 6 when Stanford arrived, looking worn and weary. We didn't discuss the case during dinner, except for Stanford's offhand comment that Oscar had submitted his reports on Brady, Dr. Jensen, and now Julian. It seemed he had called the sergeant right, after lunch, to add Julian's name to the list of subjects for inquiry. It wasn't until we settled into our favorite corner of the lounge that the conversation shifted to the murder. That brief exchange marked the start of a whole new line of investigation, one that ultimately led to the perpetrator. Stanford sank heavily into his chair, clearly feeling the pressure of the last 2 days filled with fruitless worry. His eyes showed signs of fatigue, and his mouth set in a grim line. He slowly lit a cigar and took several deep puffs. "Damn the newspapers," he muttered. "Why can't they let the district attorney's office handle its business in peace? Have you seen the afternoon papers? They're all screaming for the murderer. You'd think I had him in my pocket." "You forget, my good friend," Quentin grinned, "that we're living under the kind and uplifting rule of Democritus, which allows every fool the chance to openly criticize those smarter than themselves." Stanford scoffed. "I don't mind the criticism. It's the wild imaginations of these bright young reporters that really irritate me. They're trying to twist this grim crime into some sensational Borgia tale, filled with unchecked passion, shadowy influences, and all the trappings of a medieval romance. You'd think any schoolboy could see this is just a regular robbery and murder, the kind happening all over the country." Quentin paused while lighting a cigarette, his brows raised in surprise. Turning to Stanford, He looked at him with mild disbelief. Really? Are you saying your statement to the press was made in good faith? Stanford blinked in surprise. Of course it was. What do you mean by good faith? Quentin smiled lazily. I thought, you see, that your speech to the reporters was some sort of strategy to put the real culprit at ease and give you space to investigate. Stanford eyed him for a moment. Okay, Quentin, he said irritably. What are you getting at? Nothing at all, really, my friend, Quentin replied amiably. I knew Oscar truly believed in Porter's guilt, but it never occurred to me, you see, that you genuinely considered the crime to be the work of a professional burglar. I mistakenly thought you let Porter go this morning hoping he would lead you to the real culprit. I imagined you were just playing along with the gullible sergeant by pretending to accept his ridiculous theory. Ah, I understand now. You're still clinging to that strange theory of yours about a couple of villains hiding in separate closets or something like that, Stanford said, his sarcasm sharp. A brilliant idea, much more clever than Oscar's. I know it sounds odd, but honestly, it's no stranger than your theory about a single burglar. And why, pray tell, Stanford pressed on, his tone heated, do you find the burglar theory so strange? Simply because this wasn't the work of a professional thief at all, but rather the deliberate act of a particularly clever individual who likely spent weeks planning it. Stanford leaned back in his chair and laughed heartily. Quentin, you've brought the only spark of hope to an otherwise bleak and disheartening case. Quentin bowed with mock humility. I'm delighted, he replied smoothly, to shed even a glimmer of light into such a murky mental space. A moment of silence passed, then Stanford inquired, Is your intriguing and elaborate conclusion about the highly intelligent character of the Simon woman's murderer based on your new and original psychological deduction methods? The mockery in his voice was unmistakable. I came to that conclusion, Quentin explained sweetly, through the same logical reasoning I applied in figuring out who killed Alvin Benson. Stanford smiled. Taché, don't think I'm ungrateful enough to diminish the work you did on that case, but this time I fear you've let your theories lead you completely astray. This case is what the police would call a straightforward affair. Particularly straightforward, Quentin corrected dryly. And both you and the police are in the unfortunate position of passively waiting for your main suspect to slip up. I'll admit the situation leaves much to be desired, Stanford said, his expression somber. But even so, I can't see any way for your complex psychological methods to help. The issue is too clear-cut. That's the problem. What we really need now is solid evidence, not theories. If it weren't for the grand and romantic ideas spun by the newspaper folks, public interest in this case would have already fizzled out. Stanford, Quentin said quietly, though with unusual seriousness, if that's truly what you believe, then you might as well abandon the case right now. You're bound to fail. You see it as a clear crime. But let me tell you, it's anything but simple. It's a subtle crime, one of the subtlest you can imagine. It was carried out by someone of exceptional intellect and remarkable cunning. Quentin's confident, straightforward manner had a strangely persuasive quality, and Stanford, holding back a scoff, adopted a tone of playful sarcasm. Enlighten me, he said, as to how you came to such a wild conclusion. Gladly. Quentin took a few drags from his cigarette, watching the smoke rise into the air. I sent a draft of the following paragraphs to Quentin, and he edited them, so that as they stand now, they reflect his ideas in nearly his own words. You know, Stanford, he began in his flat, emotionless tone, every true work of art has a quality that critics refer to as élan, meaning enthusiasm and spontaneity. A copy or imitation lacks that special trait. It's too flawless, too deliberately made, too precise. Even the most knowledgeable members of the legal profession, I believe, recognize that Botticelli has bad drawing and Rubens has disproportions, don't you think? In an original piece, those imperfections don't matter. However, an imitator never includes them. They don't dare. too focused on getting every detail just right. The imitator works with a self-consciousness and meticulousness that the artist, caught up in their creative process, never shows. And here's the crux. There's no way to replicate that enthusiasm and spontaneity, that élan, found in an original piece. No matter how closely a copy may resemble the original, there's a massive psychological gap between them. The copy exudes an air of insincerity, of excessive perfection, of conscious effort. Are you coming with me? Quite enlightening, my dear Ruskin. Quentin nodded respectfully, appreciating the moment, and continued on with ease. Now, let's talk about the Simon murder. You and Oscar agree that it is a common, brutal, grim, and unimaginative crime. But while you two hounds are hot on its trail, I've chosen to look past its surface and analyze all the factors involved. I've examined it from a psychological perspective, if you will. What I've found is that this isn't a genuine and heartfelt crime, meaning it's not original, but rather a clever imitation crafted by a skilled copycat. I'm willing to grant that it fits all the typical details perfectly, but therein lies its flaw, you see. Its technique is too polished, its craftsmanship too precise. The overall effect, if you will, lacks authenticity, it feels forced. In simpler terms, it's a sham. He paused and flashed an engaging smile at Stanford. I hope this somewhat grand speech hasn't bored you. Please carry on, Stanford urged, his politeness exaggerated. Though he was joking, something in his tone suggested he was genuinely interested. What is true in art also rings true in life, Quentin continued calmly. Every human action, you see, unconsciously conveys an impression of either authenticity or fakeness, of sincerity or artifice. For instance, two men at a table might eat in the same way, handle their utensils similarly, and seemingly do the exact same things. However, although a discerning observer might not be able to pinpoint the differences, they can still sense which man's behavior is genuine and instinctual, and which is merely borrowed and self-conscious. He exhaled a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling and eased back into his chair. Now, Stanford, what are the recognizable signs of a sordid crime involving robbery and murder? Brutality, chaos, haste, drawers pulled open, desks in disarray, broken jewel cases, rings taken from the victim's fingers, severed chains, torn clothing, knocked over chairs, spilled lamps, shattered vases, tangled draperies, and scattered belongings, among other things. These are the classic signs we've come to recognize, wouldn't you agree? But think for a moment, my friend. Outside of stories and the stage, how many crimes unfold in such a perfect way, with every detail aligned and nothing to disrupt the overall effect? To put it simply, how many real crimes are executed flawlessly? None. Why is that? Because nothing in this world, nothing that is spontaneous and authentic, follows a rigid pattern in every respect. The unpredictability of chance and human error always intervenes. He made a subtle gesture to emphasize his point. Take a closer look at this particular crime. What do you notice? You'll see that its setting has been orchestrated and its plot acted out to the tiniest detail, almost like a novel by Zola. It is nearly mathematically perfect, and therein lies the compelling evidence that it was meticulously premeditated and planned. In artistic terms, it is a contrived crime. Thus, it was not born of spontaneity. Yet, curiously, I can't identify a single flaw. Its major flaw is that it is flawless. And nothing flawless, my dear fellow, is truly natural or authentic. Stanford was quiet for a moment, contemplating. Do you really dismiss even the slightest chance that a common thief could have killed the girl? He eventually asked, now devoid of any sarcasm. If a common thief did it, Quentin argued, then there's no such thing as psychology, no philosophical truths, and no standards of art. If it was an authentic act of robbery, then, by the same logic, there's no real distinction between a masterpiece and a clever imitation. So you completely rule out robbery as the motive? Stanford probed. Robbery, Quentin insisted, was merely a fabricated detail. The fact that the crime was carried out by someone with considerable insight clearly points to a much more powerful motive underlying it. Any man skilled enough to pull off such a clever deception must surely possess a good education and a vivid imagination. There's no way he would have risked killing a woman unless he felt that the threat of something even worse loomed over him. Her survival might have brought him more mental torment and danger than the act of murder itself. Faced with two monumental risks, he chose to commit murder as the lesser evil. Stanford fell silent, appearing deep in thought. Eventually, he turned to Quentin, fixing him with an uncertain look. "What about that elegantly crafted jewel box? The work of a professional burglar using a crowbar doesn't align with your artistic theory. It actually contradicts it entirely." "I know this all too well," Quentin nodded slowly. "That steel chisel has haunted me ever since I saw the evidence of its use that morning. Stanford, that chisel stands out as the one true element in an otherwise fake scene. It's as if the genuine artist arrived just as the forger finished the imitation and added a single object with the hand of a master." "But doesn't this lead us right back to Porter?" "Porter, yes, that seems to be the explanation, but not in the way you think. Porter opened the box, I won't dispute that, but by all accounts, that's the only thing he did. It was the only option available to him. That's why he ended up with just a ring that La Belle Marguerite wasn't wearing that night. All her other valuables, the ones she was adorned with, had been taken from her." "Why are you so certain about this?" "The poker, man, the poker. Can't you see? That clumsy attempt to break into the jewel case with a cast-iron poker couldn't have happened after the box was pried open. It would have had to be before. And that seemingly insane effort to break steel with cast iron was all part of the setup. The true perpetrator didn't care whether the case was opened or left untouched. His only concern was to create the appearance that he had made an effort to pry it open. He used the poker and then casually left it next to the battered box. "I understand what you're saying." This point appeared to resonate with Stanford more than any other Quentin had made, for neither Oscar nor Inspector Brenner had been able to explain the presence of the poker resting on the dressing table. "Is that why you questioned Porter as if he might have been there when your other visitor showed up?" "Exactly. Based on the evidence from the jewelry box, I figured he was either in the apartment while that fake robbery was being staged or arrived right after the act was done and the mastermind had left. From how he reacted to my inquiries, I suspect he was indeed present." "Hiding in the closet." "Yes, that would explain why the closet hadn't been disturbed. In my view, it wasn't ransacked for the rather comical reason that the polished Porter was locked inside. How else could that one wardrobe have escaped the thoroughness of the faux burglar? He wouldn't have overlooked it on purpose, and he was far too meticulous to miss it by accident. Then there are the fingerprints on the doorknob." Quentin lightly tapped the arm of his chair. "I tell you, Stanford, my dear, you absolutely must base your understanding of the crime on this theory and carry on from there. If you don't, every structure you build will come crashing down around you." Chapter 15. Our Possibilities. Wednesday, June 12, evening. When Quentin finished speaking, an uneasy silence hung in the air. Stanford, captivated by the sincerity of his friend's words, sat lost in thought. His beliefs had been shaken. The idea that Porter was guilty, which he had held on to since identifying the fingerprints, hadn't fully convinced him, even though he hadn't been able to propose another theory. Now, Quentin had outright dismissed that theory and proposed a new one that, while vague, accounted for all the physical evidence. At first resistant, Stanford found himself unexpectedly drawn to this new perspective. "Damn it, Quentin," he said. "I'm still not convinced by your dramatic theory, yet there's a strange sense of credibility in what you've analyzed. I wonder if—" He turned sharply and studied Quentin intently for a moment. "Tell me, do you have anyone in mind as the lead character in the scenario you've laid out?" "To be honest, I haven't the faintest idea who killed the woman," Quentin replied honestly. "But if you're going to find the murderer, you should be searching for a clever, superior man with nerves of steel, someone who was at great risk of being utterly ruined by her, a person with a cruel streak, vindictive by nature, an extreme egoist, a sort of fatalist, and I'm inclined to think, a touch of madness." "Madness?" "Oh, not insane. Just a madman, a perfectly rational, logical, calculating madman, just like you, me, and Van here. The difference is our interests are harmless, you see. But his obsession with getting rid of troublesome ladies who irritate him is what makes you uneasy. It's not your kind of hobby. So, you're saying you really want to skin him alive? I have to admit, Stanford replied calmly, that the urge to kill strikes me as a kind of madness. But he didn't have that kind of urge, dear Stanford. You completely overlook the subtle nuances of psychology. This man was frustrated by someone, and he set out, with remarkable thoughtfulness and reason, to eliminate the cause of his frustration. And he did it with astonishing cleverness. Sure, his actions were a bit gruesome, but when you finally catch up with him, you might be surprised to find how normal he is, quite capable, really. Stanford fell into a long, contemplative silence. After a while, he finally spoke. The only issue with your clever deductions is they don't align with the known facts of the case. And facts, my dear Quentin, are still considered by some of us old-fashioned lawyers to be quite persuasive. Why reveal your own faults? Quentin asked whimsically. After a brief pause, he added, Now, tell me what facts you believe stand against my conclusions. Well, there are only 4 men of the type you mentioned who might have had any reason to murder the Simon woman. Oscar's investigation looked deeply into her background, and for over 2 years, since she first appeared in the Follies, the only regular visitors to her apartment have been Julian, Dr. Jensen, Pop Brady, and of course, Trafford. It seems the Cardinal was rather exclusive, and no other man got close enough to her to be considered a potential murderer. It seems, then, you have a full quartet to work with. Quentin's tone was indifferent. What more do you want? A whole battalion? No, Stanford replied patiently. I just want one logical suspect. But Julian was finished with her over a year ago. Brady and Trafford both have solid alibis, which leaves only Dr. Jensen, and I can't quite picture him as a strangler and petty thief, despite his temper. He has an alibi, and it might actually be a solid one. Quentin shook his head. There's something almost sad about the naive confidence of the legal mind. It does tend to stick to logic at times, doesn't it? Stanford remarked. My dear friend, Quentin scolded him, the assumption in that statement is quite presumptuous. If you could truly tell the difference between rational and irrational thinking, you wouldn't be a lawyer, you'd be a deity. No, you're approaching this the wrong way. The key elements of the case aren't what you consider the known facts, but rather the unknown factors, the human variables, if you will, the personalities of the 4 in question. He lit a fresh cigarette and reclined back, closing his eyes. Tell me what you know about these 4 young men. You mentioned Oscar has submitted his report. What about their mothers? What do they eat for breakfast? Are they allergic to poison ivy? Let's start with Trafford's background. Do you know anything about him? In general terms, Stanford replied. He comes from old Puritan stock, I believe, governors, burgomasters, a few successful merchants. All of them Yankees, no mixing of bloodlines. In fact, Trafford embodies the oldest and most resilient of New England's elite, though I suspect the so-called purity of the Puritans has become somewhat diluted over the years. His involvement with the Simon girl hardly aligns with the older Puritans' strict self-denial. Yet it completely aligns with the psychological responses that often arise from such strictness, Quentin interjected. But what does he do for a living? Where does his money come from? His father made a fortune manufacturing automotive parts and left the business to him. He tinkers with it, but not seriously, though I believe he has designed a few accessories. I hope that dreadful cut-glass vase for holding paper bouquets isn't one of them. The person who came up with that awful decoration is capable of any terrible crime. Then it couldn't have been Trafford, Stanford said with a smile, for he certainly doesn't fit the profile of your potential killer. We know the girl was alive after he left her, and that, during the time she was murdered, he was with Judge Redfern. Even you, Quentin, couldn't twist those facts to turn against the gentleman. On that, at least, we agree, Quentin replied, and that's everything you know about him. That's all I have, except that he married a wealthy woman a daughter of a Southern senator, if I remember correctly. That doesn't help us. Now, let's hear about Julian's background. Stanford glanced at a typewritten sheet of paper. Both parents were immigrants, arrived in steerage. Their original name was Manicuix or something like that. He was born on the East Side, learned the fur trade in his father's shop on Hester Street, worked for the San Francisco Cloak Company, and eventually became the factory foreman. He saved his money and made some smart real estate investments, then went into the fur business on his own. Through hard work, he built himself up to his current wealthy status. Attended public school and night classes at a commercial college, married in 1900 but divorced a year later. He lives a flashy life, supports the nightlife, but never gets drunk. I'd say he's a typical spender and socialite. He has invested in a few musical comedies and always seems to have a beautiful woman by his side. He has a thing for blondes. Not very enlightening, Quentin sighed. The city is full of Mannixes. What did you find out about our fashionable doctor? I fear the city has its share of Dr. Lindquists as well. He grew up in a small Midwestern town of French and Hungarian descent, earned his M.D. from Ohio State Medical, practiced in Chicago. There were some questionable dealings, although he was never convicted. Then he came to Albany and took advantage of the X-ray machine craze, invented a breast pump and formed a stock company, made a small fortune from that, spent 2 years in Vienna. Ah, the Freudian influence. Returned to New York and opened a private sanitarium, charged outrageous fees, which won him favor with the nouveau rich. He's been in that business ever since. He was involved in a breach of promise suit years ago, but that case was settled privately. He's not married. He wouldn't be, Quentin replied. People of his kind rarely are. It's quite an intriguing summary, though, yes, definitely intriguing. I'm tempted to develop a neurosis just to have Ambroise treat me. I want to understand him better. And where was this questionable healer when our misguided sister met her end? Ah, who can say, my dear Stanford? Who knows? Who knows? Regardless, I don't think he was involved in any murder. You're so biased, Quentin exclaimed. But let's move on, reluctantly. What's your take on Brady? The fact that he's affectionately called Pop is a good starting point. It's hard to imagine Beethoven being nicknamed Shorty or Bismarck referred to as Snookums. Brady has spent most of his life in politics, a long-time Tammany Hall regular. He was a ward boss at 25, managed a Democratic club in Brooklyn for a spell, served 2 terms as an alderman, and practiced law broadly. He became tax commissioner, then left politics to run a small racing stable. Later, he secured an illegal gambling concession in Saratoga, and now runs a pool hall in Jersey City. He's what you might call a professional gambler. He enjoys his drink. No marriages recorded. None that I could find. But listen, Brady's off the hook. He was ticketed in Boonton that night at 11:30. Is that the watertight alibi you mentioned earlier? In my rudimentary legal understanding, yes. The summons was issued to him at 11:30. It's clearly marked. Boonton is 50 miles away, a solid 2-hour drive. So Brady must have left New York around 9:30, and even if he had rushed back here, he couldn't have arrived until well after the medical examiner concluded the girl was dead. As part of my investigation, I looked into the summons and even spoke to the officer who issued it. The document was legitimate. I should know. I had it quashed. Did this Boonton officer know Brady by sight? No, but he provided me with a detailed description of him. And naturally, he took down the car's number. Quentin gazed at Stanford, his eyes wide with sorrow. My dear Stanford, my truly dear Stanford, can't you see that all you've really demonstrated is that a country traffic officer issued a speeding ticket to a smooth-faced, middle-aged, stout man driving Brady's car near Boonton at 11:30 on the night of the murder? And good heavens, isn't that exactly the kind of alibi our friend would arrange if he planned to take the lady's life around midnight? Come now, Stanford chuckled. That's a bit far-fetched. You'd credit every lawbreaker with fabricating the most cunning schemes. Indeed I would, Quentin replied, somewhat dispassionately. And you know, I quite believe that's precisely the sort of plan a lawbreaker would devise if he were scheming a murder with his own life on the line. What truly astonishes me is your naive assumption that a murderer wouldn't consider his own safety at all. It's rather touching, you know. Stanford grunted in response. Well, you can trust me when I say that it was Brady himself who got that ticket. I suppose you might be right, Quentin acknowledged. I only put forward the possibility of deception, you see. The one point I insist on is that the captivating Miss Simon was killed by someone with a subtle and superior mind. And I, in turn, Stanford said irritably, insist that the only men of that sort who were close enough to her to have a reason to do so are Julian, Brady, Jensen, and Trafford. Moreover, I maintain that not one of them seems like a plausible suspect. I'm afraid I must disagree with you, my dear friend, Quentin said calmly. They're all possibilities, and one of them is guilty. Stanford glared at him with disdain. Well, well, so the case is resolved. Now, if you could just tell me which one it is, I'll arrest him immediately and return to my other duties. You're always in such a hurry, Quentin lamented. Why rush? The wisdom of the world's philosophers would advise against it. Make haste slowly, says Caesar, or as Rufus puts it, haste is slow. The Koran straightforwardly states that haste belongs to the devil. Shakespeare often marked speed in his writings. He tires early, who rushes too quickly. And, wisely and slowly, those who run fast often stumble. Then there was Molière, remember Esganarelle, who remarked, too much haste leads us to error. Chaucer shared similar sentiments. He moves well, he said, who wisely knows how to wait. Even the common folk have captured this notion in countless proverbs. Good things and quick things seldom meet, and hasty people never lack for trouble. Stanford stood up, a look of irritation on his face. Enough! I'm heading home before you start telling a bedtime story, he grumbled. Ironically, Quentin did end up telling a bedtime story that night, but he shared it with me in the privacy of his own library, and the essence of it was this. Oscar is fully convinced of Porter's guilt, and Stanford is caught up in legal complexities, just like the unfortunate Cardinal was trapped by strong hands. Alas, Van, there's nothing left for me but to set out tomorrow a cappella, like Gaboriau's Monsieur Lecoq, and see what can be achieved in the noble pursuit of justice. I will disregard both Oscar and Stanford, and become like a solitary pelican in the wilderness, an owl in the desert, a sparrow all alone on the rooftop. Truly, you know, I'm not some champion of society, but I can't stand an unsolved mystery.